The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as people shuffled to their seats. The air was thick with expectation, the weight of justice looming over the proceedings. Judge Walter Grayson took his seat at the bench, his robe pristine, his gavel resting within reach. He was a man of stature, known for his strict demeanor and, though rarely acknowledged outright, his unspoken biases. Across the room, Amara Cole adjusted her blazer, her presence calm yet commanding. She had prepared meticulously for this case, just as she always did. It wasn't just about winning. This was about setting a precedent, about showing that justice was not a privilege reserved for a select few. She had faced adversity before, but today's battle was already brewing before she even uttered a word. Judge Grayson barely glanced at her before flipping through his papers. His tone, clipped and dismissive, carried through the courtroom. "Ms. Cole, I assume you're here assisting Mr. Donovan?" He gestured toward the white male attorney seated beside her, who immediately stiffened. "No, Your Honor," Amara replied, her voice steady. "I am lead counsel for the defense." The judge looked up, his expression unreadable for a moment before his lips twisted into something resembling amusement. "Lead counsel?" he repeated, as if the concept itself was foreign. "How modern." A few murmurs rippled through the gallery, but Amara remained poised. "Yes, Your Honor," she confirmed, refusing to take the bait. "Shall we proceed?" Grayson leaned back in his chair, regarding her as one might assess an impudent child. "Very well," he drawled. "Let's see if you can keep up." The words dripped with condescension, but Amara gave no reaction. She had encountered men like him before, men who mistook arrogance for intelligence, who believed that power was a birthright rather than something earned. The proceedings began, and Grayson wasted no time making his disapproval known. He interrupted Amara repeatedly, overruling valid objections and scrutinizing her every word. When she cited case law, he dismissed it with a wave of his hand, as though her knowledge was inherently flawed. The prosecution, led by an attorney who had argued before Grayson many times, was met with no such resistance. Amara could feel the tension rising in the room. The jury noticed. The spectators noticed. Even the court clerk cast occasional glances in her direction, as if waiting to see how she would respond. But Amara did not rise to anger. Instead, she leaned into her expertise, articulating her arguments with unwavering precision. She would not allow this judge to rattle her. At one point, Grayson let out an exaggerated sigh. "Miss Cole, I don't have all day," he said, rubbing his temple. "Perhaps if you'd spent more time refining your arguments rather than reciting legal textbooks, we'd make some progress." A few chuckles echoed from the prosecution's table. Amara tilted her head slightly. "My apologies, Your Honor," she said smoothly. "I assumed you'd appreciate a thorough understanding of the law." There was no malice in her voice, only an undeniable confidence. Grayson's face darkened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he gestured for her to continue, though the irritation in his expression was evident. He wasn't used to being challenged, least of all by someone like her. The morning stretched into the afternoon, and despite Grayson's clear disdain, Amara's defense was airtight. Facts didn't bend under bias, and her strategy was meticulous. By the time the court adjourned for recess, murmurs had turned into whispers. Those present knew they had witnessed something significant. As the courtroom emptied, Amara gathered her notes, prepared to leave. But before she could, a bailiff approached. "Judge Grayson would like to see you in his chambers," he said, voice neutral. Amara nodded, unsurprised. She had expected this. When she entered the judge's office, Grayson was seated behind his massive wooden desk, fingers steepled in front of him. The room smelled of old books and cigar smoke, an air of authority carefully curated over years. "Shut the door," he said, not looking up. She complied but remained standing. "I'm going to offer you some advice, Miss Cole," he said finally, his voice deceptively calm. "The courtroom isn't a place to make statements. It's a place to win cases. And I suggest you learn how things work before you start making enemies." Amara's expression remained unreadable. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I know exactly how things work." Grayson scoffed. "Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, you're spending more time proving a point than defending your client." She met his gaze evenly. "I am doing both." For a brief moment, something flickered in Grayson's eyes, annoyance, perhaps, or something deeper. A realization that Amara was not someone he could intimidate. "We'll see how long that confidence lasts," he muttered, turning his attention back to his papers. "You're dismissed." Amara didn't move right away. Instead, she let the silence stretch, let him feel the weight of her presence. Then finally she nodded. "Have a good day, Judge Grayson," she said, and with that, she turned and walked out. The battle had only just begun. If you are enjoying this video, why don't you give a like? While you are there, click on the subscribe button down below, and also turn on the bell notification to get notified whenever I drop a new video. The courtroom was quieter than before, but the tension still crackled in the air. Judge Walter Grayson sat at the bench, his fingers tapping impatiently against the polished wood. The recess had given him time to stew over the morning's proceedings, and he wasn't pleased. That woman, Amara Cole, had challenged him in his own courtroom. She had spoken with a level of confidence he found unsettling, as though she had no fear of his authority. Grayson had dealt with ambitious lawyers before, but Amara was different. There was something about her presence that disturbed him, an unshakable poise that made it clear she wouldn't be intimidated. He didn't like that. In his world, respect was given, not demanded, especially from someone like her. As the court reconvened, Amara entered with the same unflappable composure. She walked to the defense table and set down her legal pad, her movements deliberate and measured. She didn't acknowledge the judge beyond the professional courtesy required, but the confidence in her posture spoke volumes. She knew the game, and she wasn't here to play by anyone's rules but the law's. Grayson cleared his throat. "Let's proceed," he said, his voice clipped. He turned his gaze toward Amara. "Ms. Cole, I trust you've had time to reconsider your approach. Perhaps today we can move forward without unnecessary theatrics." There were a few snickers from the prosecution's side, but Amara remained unbothered. She met Grayson's gaze evenly. "I'm here to defend my client to the best of my ability, Your Honor. That won't change." Grayson's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. He gestured for the prosecution to continue, and the opposing attorney launched into his argument. Amara listened carefully, taking notes with the precision of someone who anticipated every counterpoint before it was even made. When it was her turn, she rose smoothly and walked to the center of the courtroom. She began dismantling the prosecution's case with surgical precision, addressing each argument with well-cited legal precedent and undeniable logic. The jury was attentive, their focus shifting toward her as she spoke. Even those in the gallery seemed drawn in, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Grayson, however, was growing increasingly agitated. Every time Amara delivered a strong point, he found himself grasping for a way to undercut her. He interrupted her mid-sentence, overruled valid objections, and repeatedly asked her to simplify her statements, as if she were incapable of articulating complex legal arguments. At one point, he leaned forward, his expression laced with condescension. "Ms. Cole, I understand that you're passionate," he said, choosing his words carefully, "but this courtroom isn't the place for grandstanding. Stick to the facts." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Everyone could hear the thinly veiled slight. Amara didn't flinch. She let the moment settle before responding, her voice steady. "Your Honor, I am sticking to the facts. If you'd prefer, I can provide even more detailed citations to ensure there's no confusion." The air grew thick with anticipation. A few jurors exchanged glances. The message was clear. Amara wasn't the one struggling to keep up. Grayson's face darkened. "That won't be necessary," he snapped. "Proceed." Amara did, unshaken by his hostility. She finished her argument with precision, leaving the jury with no doubt about the strength of her case. By the time she sat down, even the prosecution seemed rattled. Grayson, however, refused to let it go. As the trial continued, his attempts to undermine Amara became more blatant. He ruled against her on motions that should have been granted. He addressed her in a tone that barely concealed his disdain. Yet, through it all, Amara remained composed, as though she knew something he didn't. And she did. By the end of the session, Grayson was exhausted. The case was far from over, but he already felt like he was losing control. He dismissed the court for the day, rubbing his temples as the courtroom emptied. As Amara gathered her things, she caught the eye of a court clerk who gave her a knowing nod. Others had noticed what was happening. The difference was that Amara wasn't powerless. As she left the courtroom, her phone buzzed with a message. She glanced at it and allowed herself the smallest smile. Everything was about to change. Judge Walter Grayson sat in his chambers, fingers steepled beneath his chin, replaying the day's proceedings in his mind. The irritation clawed at him. Amara Cole had been an unmovable force in his courtroom, and he hated that. He was used to lawyers, especially young ones, tripping over their words under his scrutiny, scrambling to adjust their arguments when he applied pressure. But Amara? She hadn't flinched, hadn't stumbled, hadn't shown an ounce of weakness. His reputation preceded him. Lawyers feared his courtroom. He was known for cutting down those who dared challenge him. Yet, somehow, this woman had stood before him, matching his every jab with measured precision. She hadn't just held her ground, she had commanded the space in a way that left even the jury spellbound. Grayson exhaled sharply, standing up and pacing his office. It wasn't just her skill that unsettled him. It was the way she carried herself, as if she knew something he didn't. As if she were privy to a secret he had yet to uncover. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he barked. The bailiff stepped inside. "Miss Cole is here to see you, Your Honor. You asked to speak with her earlier." Grayson frowned, momentarily forgetting that he'd sent for her after court adjourned. He straightened his tie, collecting himself before nodding. "Send her in." The bailiff stepped aside, and Amara Cole walked in with the same unshakable confidence she'd displayed all day. She was calm, composed, and utterly unreadable. If she had any frustration over how he had treated her in the courtroom, she didn't show it. Grayson gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit." "I'm fine standing, thank you," Amara replied smoothly. His lips pressed into a thin line. He wasn't used to being challenged in his own space. "I wanted to have a word with you about today's proceedings," he said, folding his arms. "You're a talented attorney, Ms. Cole, but let me give you a piece of advice. My courtroom is not the place for making a spectacle." Amara arched a brow. "A spectacle?" Grayson nodded. "Theatrics don't win cases. Experience does. And you may have a sharp tongue, but experience is something you lack. I suggest you learn how to pick your battles before you burn bridges you'll need in the future." There it was again, that smug arrogance, the belief that he was bestowing wisdom upon her. Amara let the silence linger, studying him with an unreadable expression. Then finally she spoke. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I've been practicing law for over a decade. I've won cases against attorneys twice my age, argued before some of the toughest judges in the state, and built a career on knowing exactly which battles to pick." She took a deliberate step forward. "If you think what I did today was theatrics, then perhaps you're not as experienced as you think." Grayson stiffened. "Watch yourself, Ms. Cole." "Likewise," she replied evenly. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken tension. Grayson could feel something shifting beneath the surface, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Then, just as quickly as the moment had built, Amara turned toward the door. "Good evening, Your Honor." She walked out without another word, leaving Grayson standing in his office, his pulse hammering in his ears. He had called her in to assert his dominance, to remind her of her place. Instead, he was the one left unsettled. And for the first time in his career, he had the uneasy feeling that he might be the one on the losing side of a power struggle. The next morning, Judge Walter Grayson arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. He needed the silence of his chambers to collect himself before another round with Amara Cole. The conversation from the previous evening still gnawed at him. She had stood in his office, unwavering, unafraid, and utterly unapologetic. That woman was dangerous, not because she was reckless, but because she was calculated. He had underestimated her once, and he wouldn't make that mistake again. As he sipped his coffee, he opened his email. He skimmed through the usual correspondence until his eyes landed on an official memo marked urgent from the Judicial Oversight Committee. His stomach twisted. He clicked the email, his eyes narrowing as he read the first few lines. Effective immediately, the Judicial Oversight Committee is pleased to announce the appointment of Amara Cole as the new Chief Judge of the Circuit Court. She will be assuming oversight responsibilities and will conduct an internal review of courtroom procedures. Grayson's hands tightened around his coffee cup. His breath stilled in his chest. He reread the email, convinced he had misunderstood. Amara Cole, Chief Judge. No, it had to be a mistake. He clicked out of the email and reached for his desk phone. His fingers trembled slightly as he dialed a number he rarely called, Robert Stanton, head of the Judicial Appointment Board. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Grayson, what can I do for you?" Grayson forced his tone to remain neutral. "Robert, I just saw an email about the new Chief Judge appointment. Amara Cole?" He let the question linger, hoping there had been some clerical error, some misunderstanding. But Stanton only let out a small chuckle. "Ah yes, I figured you'd be calling. It's quite the shake-up, isn't it? First black woman to hold the position. A historic moment." Grayson's grip on the phone tightened. "She doesn't have the experience for that position." "On the contrary," Stanton replied, his voice smooth. "She has exactly the experience. Brilliant legal mind. Unshakable in the courtroom. Not to mention, she's been on the short list for months." Grayson's breath came slow and measured. Months. Oh yes, Stanton continued. It's been in the works for a while. The committee was just waiting for the right moment to announce it. The governor signed off on it personally. There was a pause. I assume you've already had the pleasure of meeting her? Grayson closed his eyes. You could say that. Well, Stanton said, then I suggest you get used to addressing her as Chief Judge Cole. The line went dead. Grayson slowly lowered the receiver, his mind reeling. Amara Cole, his boss, the woman he had dismissed in his courtroom, the attorney he had belittled, the lawyer he had called into his chambers to condescend to. He felt sick. The shift in power was staggering. Yesterday, he had spoken down to her, treating her as if she were just another attorney passing through his courtroom. Today, she had complete authority over him. He swallowed the bitterness rising in his throat. How much had she known when she stood in his office last night? Had she already been aware of her appointment? The thought made his stomach churn. There was a sharp knock at his door. Come in, he called, his voice strained. The door swung open, and there she was. Amara Cole stepped inside, dressed in a crisp navy blue suit, her expression unreadable. The presence she had carried in his courtroom was now amplified, the weight of her new position settling comfortably around her. She met his gaze without hesitation. Good morning, Judge Grayson, she said smoothly. I trust you received the email. Grayson swallowed hard, forcing a tight-lipped smile. I did. She tilted her head slightly. Then I assume you understand what this means. He nodded stiffly. It means you'll be overseeing all judicial conduct in this circuit. Her lips curved slightly, but it wasn't quite a smile. That's correct. And I'll be starting my review of courtroom proceedings immediately. Grayson clenched his jaw. A review. He knew exactly what that meant. His rulings, his behavior, his biases, everything would be scrutinized under her watch. Amara let the silence stretch before speaking again. I want to make one thing clear, Judge Grayson. I don't hold grudges, but I do expect fairness. In all cases. Her words carried a quiet power, a warning wrapped in diplomacy. Grayson nodded, knowing he had no choice but to comply. Understood. She gave a curt nod. Good. Then, just as she had done the night before, she turned toward the door. But before she left, she paused. Oh, and one more thing, Judge Grayson. He braced himself. Yes. She glanced over her shoulder. I trust that from now on, you'll address me properly. Her gaze was steady, unwavering. He swallowed his pride and forced the words out. Yes, Chief Judge Cole. She nodded once, then walked out, leaving him alone in his chambers, his world completely turned upside down. Judge Walter Grayson sat stiffly on the bench, his grip on the gavel unusually tight. The courtroom was alive with whispers as people took their seats, but he barely heard them. His mind was elsewhere, fixated on the woman seated at the front of the courtroom. Chief Judge Amara Cole. She had taken her place at the observer's table, poised and unreadable, her mere presence suffocating him. This was her first day formally overseeing his courtroom, and everyone knew it. The shift in power was palpable, an unspoken tension crackling between them. Grayson had spent the morning attempting to convince himself that this was just another day, that he would run his court as he always had, that he was still the authority in this room. But the weight of Amara's presence told him otherwise. He was being watched, judged in the very way he had judged her. He cleared his throat, his voice sharper than intended. Court is now in session. The first case was a routine hearing, an arraignment. A young black man stood before the court, flanked by his public defender. Grayson glanced at the case file, then at the defendant. The charge was minor, a nonviolent offense. In the past, Grayson might have issued a harsh warning and a steep fine, making an example of the young man. But today he hesitated. He could feel Amara's eyes on him. He read through the file again. The young man had no prior offenses. He was employed with strong community ties. The recommended sentence was probation. Grayson's fingers twitched on the gavel. Normally, he would have ruled without a second thought. But today, the weight of his past decisions pressed down on him. How many similar cases had he ruled on with unnecessary severity? How many times had he let his biases shape his decisions without a second glance? He inhaled sharply. The court will follow the sentencing recommendation. Probation granted. A murmur rippled through the gallery, surprise, approval. The defendant's shoulders slumped in relief. Grayson forced himself to look at Amara. She met his gaze without expression, but something about her eyes told him she had noticed. She noticed everything. The next case was another test, and the one after that. Each time, Grayson found himself second-guessing the very instincts that had once come so easily to him. The unchecked authority he had wielded for years now felt like a double-edged sword, and Amara stood at the other end, watching, waiting. When the morning session ended, Grayson retreated to his chambers, closing the door behind him with more force than necessary. His breath came shallow as he loosened his tie, the frustration simmering beneath his skin. A sharp knock sounded at the door. He didn't need to ask who it was. "Come in," he said, his voice flat. Amara stepped inside, her movements unhurried. She closed the door behind her, giving the room a measured glance before turning her attention to him. "Quite the change in judicial temperament today," she said lightly. Grayson clenched his jaw. "I don't know what you mean." Amara's lips curved ever so slightly. "Don't you?" Silence stretched between them. He knew what she was doing. He had done it himself countless times, letting the weight of unspoken truths settle over an opponent until they cracked under it. Grayson exhaled sharply. "You wanted to see a fair courtroom," he said. "I gave you one." Amara studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Good. Keep it that way. If you are enjoying this video, why don't you give a like? While you are there, click on the subscribe button down below, and also turn on the bell notification to get notified whenever I drop a new video." He bristled at the implied warning, but he said nothing. What argument could he make? He had built a career on unchecked power, on knowing that no one questioned his authority. But now there was someone watching, someone who would hold him accountable. Amara turned to leave but paused at the door. "One more thing," she said without looking back. "This isn't about me. It never was. It's about the people who stand before your bench, hoping for fairness. You should ask yourself why you needed someone like me in this room to finally start delivering it." She didn't wait for a response. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Grayson alone with a question he wasn't sure he wanted to answer. The courthouse halls felt different now. Judge Walter Grayson had walked these corridors for years, always certain of his authority, his power, his control. But today, as he moved through the building, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was the one being scrutinized. It wasn't paranoia. It was reality. Ever since Chief Judge Amara Cole had taken over, his courtroom had become a stage, a place where his every decision was weighed, measured, and judged. The same way he had once done to others without a second thought. He had been on the bench for nearly 2 decades, yet in the past week he had begun questioning things he had never questioned before. That woman. That damn woman. She had turned his world upside down without ever raising her voice, without making a single direct accusation. She didn't have to. Her presence alone forced him to see what he had long ignored. Grayson entered his chambers, only to find a thick envelope waiting on his desk. His name was printed on it, bold and official. Judicial Oversight Review, Chief Judge Amara Cole. His stomach twisted. He sank into his chair and opened the envelope with stiff fingers, unfolding the documents inside. It was worse than he had imagined. A full review of his courtroom history. Bias reports. Complaints. A pattern of excessive sentencing in minority cases. A clear disparity in how he handled defendants based on race, economic status, and legal representation. He knew deep down that if he had seen this file written about another judge, he would have made his own quiet judgments. Unfair. Rigid. Harsh. He had always prided himself on being tough but fair. But now he wasn't so sure. A single page stood out, a personal statement from Amara. Justice is not about power. It's about responsibility. A judge is not measured by how many people fear him, but by how many trust in his ability to be fair. That is the true weight of the bench. Grayson's throat tightened. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, the weight of years pressing down on him. He had spent so much of his career believing that his authority was what kept the courtroom in order. But now, faced with cold, undeniable facts, he had to confront an uncomfortable truth. He had been wrong. And the worst part, Amara Cole had known it all along. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He knew who it was before he even spoke. "Come in." Amara entered, holding her own copy of the review in her hands. She placed it on his desk without a word, then sat across from him, crossing her legs. She looked at him expectantly, waiting. Grayson cleared his throat. "So this is it, then?" She tilted her head slightly. "What do you think this is?" He exhaled through his nose. "A warning." "No," Amara said, leaning forward slightly. "It's a choice." Grayson frowned. "A choice?" She nodded. "You can fight this. Call it an overreach, argue that the data is skewed, blame the system that put you in this position. You wouldn't be the first judge to do it. But that won't change the truth." She paused, then met his gaze with quiet intensity. "Or You can do something different. Grayson swallowed. And what's that? You can change, she said simply. Silence settled between them. Grayson let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Change. Just like that. No, Amara said, shaking her head. Not just like that. Change is a decision. And then it's a commitment. A process. A fight. Especially when it means unlearning years of habits. But the alternative? She tapped the review file. The alternative is being remembered as this. Grayson looked at the report again. Bias. Unfair sentencing. Racial disparity. Was that really what his legacy would be? He ran a hand over his face, exhaustion creeping into his bones. And if I try? If I change? He exhaled sharply. What then? Amara studied him for a long moment before answering. Then maybe for the first time, you'll actually be the judge you always thought you were. She stood, leaving him with that thought. Grayson remained seated long after she left, staring at the pages in front of him. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure what kind of judge he truly was. But he knew one thing for certain, he couldn't ignore the truth anymore. Judge Walter Grayson stood before the mirror in his chambers, adjusting his tie with slow, deliberate movements. His reflection stared back at him, tired but contemplative. The weight of the past few weeks had settled deep into his bones, heavier than any gavel he had ever wielded. Today was different. Today, he was the one being judged. The courtroom was already packed when he stepped inside. The whispers that followed him were nothing new, but the undercurrent of curiosity in the room was. People were waiting to see what he would do, what kind of judge he would be now that his name had been dragged through the kind of scrutiny he had so easily imposed on others. At the front, seated in her usual spot, was Chief Judge Amara Cole. She watched him with the same unreadable expression she had worn since the day she first walked into his courtroom. But he knew now that it wasn't indifference, it was patience. She had been waiting to see what choice he would make. Grayson took his seat, scanning the case before him. A young woman, no older than 20, stood with her attorney at the defendant's table. She was black, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her posture rigid with fear. He looked at the file. A minor drug possession charge. No prior record. No history of violence. A case that, a month ago, he might have handled differently. A month ago, he would have called her reckless. He would have scolded her about personal responsibility before handing down a harsh sentence, convinced he was teaching her a lesson. But today he sat still thinking. Amara's words echoed in his mind. Justice is not about power. It's about responsibility. He took a deep breath. The court acknowledges that the defendant has no prior record and is eligible for the diversion program. Instead of incarceration, she will be enrolled in a rehabilitation program with community service. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. He saw the relief on the young woman's face, the grateful nod from her attorney. And out of the corner of his eye, he saw Amara Cole watching. This time, he met her gaze head-on. For the first time, she gave him the smallest nod of approval. After the session ended, Grayson returned to his chambers. He expected to be alone, but Amara was already there, waiting for him. "You surprised me," she said simply. He chuckled, shaking his head. "Did I?" She nodded. "That was a fair ruling." He sighed, sinking into his chair. "I suppose you're waiting for some grand confession. Some speech about how I see the error of my ways." Amara folded her arms. "I don't need a speech, Judge Grayson. I just need to know if this is permanent, or just for show." Grayson looked at her, really looked at her. She had never wanted to ruin him. She had never sought revenge. She only wanted what was right. And for the first time, he wanted that too. "I don't know what kind of judge I'll be tomorrow," he admitted. "But I know I don't want to be the one I was yesterday." A long silence stretched between them. Then finally Amara smiled. "Just a little." "That's a start," she said. And with that, she walked out, leaving him alone with his thoughts, and the beginning of something new.